At the beginning, I would like to present the current situation in Ukraine and encourage everyone to help raise funds for those in need. My current fundraising effort is dedicated to helping my neighbors and their families who have lost everything in Bakhmut, in the eastern part of Ukraine. Right now, they are left without a home and are forced to move from place to place. Unfortunately, the temporary shelters they are using are not suitable for living, and they are compelled to keep relocating. Most of these people are elderly or mothers with children. This fundraiser will help them find a suitable place to live for a while, provide food, and allow them to spend Christmas in warm conditions with the essentials they need. So I am asking each of you, if you can, to please help by sending whatever you can, so that these people can at least buy decent food for Christmas and spend the holiday season in safe, comfortable conditions. Thank you very much for your understanding. Now we're going to move to oust stories. It's only been a few weeks since I moved into my first apartment, a tiny unit in an old brick complex at the edge of town. I'm 22 and new to living alone, so I was a little nervous but also excited. The place has character, with its creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways, but it also has a slightly eerie, empty feel, as if it's been waiting for years for someone to fill the silence. The complex is 3 stories tall with only 6 apartments, and mine is on the top floor, tucked away at the end of a shadowy corridor. On my first night, I was unpacking late, too energized to sleep, so I made myself some tea and sat on the worn-out couch, listening to the old pipes creak and settle in the quiet. Around 11 p. Just as I was finally getting comfortable, I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway outside my door, followed by a faint tapping sound, like someone was drumming their fingers against the wall. I thought nothing of it at first, chalking it up to one of the few neighbors moving around. But then the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. Curious, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A man, possibly in his 60s, with stringy gray hair and wearing clothes that seemed too large for his thin frame, was standing just a few feet from my door, staring straight ahead at my door. He didn't move. He just stood there, expressionless, his eyes dark and unsettling. After a few tense seconds, he lifted his hand and tapped his fingers on my door, slowly, rhythmically, almost as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I swallowed hard and hesitated before slowly unlocking the deadbolt and cracking the door open just a little. "Hello," I said quietly, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. He didn't respond. Instead, he blinked, his eyes seeming to refocus, as though he hadn't realized he was standing outside my door. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like "so many," before he turned and shuffled away, his footsteps fading down the stairs. I quickly shut and locked the door, backing away as if he might suddenly reappear. I tried to calm myself, brushing it off as just a strange encounter with an odd neighbor. I managed to push the thought out of my mind as I got ready for bed, making sure every door and window was locked tight before finally lying down. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to a faint, scraping noise coming from outside my bedroom window, which was just above my bed. My heart raced as I listened, the noise gradually becoming more distinct, a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging down the glass. I lay frozen, my mind racing, as I tried to think of what could possibly be making that noise at this hour. After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped, and everything went silent. Relieved, I tried to fall back asleep, but that's when I heard it again. The slow, steady footsteps, this time directly outside my front door. The doorknob jiggled slightly, as if someone was testing the lock. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, too scared to even move. Eventually, the sound faded away, but I lay there, wide awake, until dawn. When morning finally came, I decided to leave my apartment to clear my mind, and just as I stepped outside, I noticed a faint, greasy handprint on the glass of my bedroom window. My stomach churned. How long had he been standing there, watching me sleep? And why was he even there? Days went by without another incident, but every night, I feel his presence lingering outside, waiting in the shadows. Now, every creak of the floor, every tap of the pipes, sends chills down my spine. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door that night, or if I had dared to look outside my window. But the worst part, just last night, I heard him again. Those familiar, soft footsteps, and a whisper I could barely make out. It sounded like, "Let me in." Growing up in a small town, I spent countless hours exploring the forests that bordered our neighborhood. The woods were thick and overgrown, with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating pockets of shadow, even during the day. At night, the place felt like another world entirely. A world of whispers and secrets that was best left undisturbed. One evening, my friend and I ventured too far, too late, and discovered just how terrifying those woods could become after dark. It was a Friday night, and my best friend, Max, had come over for a sleepover. The plan was to spend the evening hanging out in the woods, talking, and maybe daring each other to explore the darker parts. We grabbed 2 heavy flashlights and set out as the sun was setting. The last beams of light casting an eerie orange glow over the dense forest. We'd been out there many times, but this evening felt different. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier, almost as if the trees were pressing in closer. After about 15 minutes, we found our usual spot, a massive fallen tree, and sat down to talk. We lost track of time, our conversation drifting from school to ghost stories and everything in between. When I finally looked up, I realized it was nearly pitch black. The last traces of daylight had disappeared, and the woods were swallowed by shadows. "Guess we should head back," Max muttered, sounding as uneasy as I felt. We turned on our flashlights and started walking back, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Every tree looked the same, and I felt a creeping sense of dread settle over me. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the crunching of leaves under our feet. I glanced at Max, and he looked just as tense. As we walked, we suddenly heard footsteps ahead of us, soft but distinct, as if someone was moving slowly through the underbrush. My stomach twisted as I realized we weren't alone. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, straining my ears to listen. Whoever it was, they were moving carefully, almost deliberately, as if they didn't want to be heard. Who? Who's there? I called out, my voice sounding much weaker than I intended. No answer. The footsteps just stopped. Max and I exchanged a look, our eyes wide with fear. In the silence that followed, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, like there were eyes hiding just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Before I could say anything, the footsteps started again, this time behind us. They were faster, closer. Without a word, Max and I took off, sprinting through the forest as fast as we could. Branches clawed at my arms and face, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the relentless footsteps following us. At some point, I noticed the footsteps had veered off to the right, growing fainter. I slowed down slightly, but fear gnawed at me. If that wasn't Max behind me, who or what was it? I finally reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, and looked around, realizing Max wasn't with me. Panic surged through me, and I ran into my backyard, calling out for him. Minutes later, he burst through the trees, pale and out of breath. He told me he'd heard footsteps too, but they were in a different direction, and they had sounded far too heavy to be mine. We ran into the house and told my parents what had happened, but of course they thought it was just our imaginations running wild. We never went back into those woods at night, though. Max and I still talk about that night sometimes, wondering who or what was out there, watching us. Living alone has its perks, the freedom, the quiet, and the ability to set your own rules. But that silence can turn sinister when you realize you might not be as alone as you thought. That was exactly the feeling that crept over me the night I lost my phone. A night that left me questioning whether I had truly been alone in my own home. It was a Friday night, and my friends and I were out at a local bar to watch the opening act of a new band. We'd rushed out, barely grabbing our wallets and keys, too eager to waste a second. The place was packed, the music was loud, and everything was going great, until I reached for my phone to check the time and realized it wasn't there. I checked every pocket, asked my friends, and even scoured the area around where we'd been sitting, but it was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, we tried calling it from a friend's phone, hoping I'd left it in the car, or maybe somewhere nearby. To my surprise, someone actually picked up. "Hello?" I said, straining to hear over the music, but there was only silence on the other end, punctuated by faint, slow breathing. Hello?" I repeated, louder this time, but still. There was no response, just that eerie, steady breathing. Then, abruptly, they hung up. The whole thing unsettled me, but I brushed it off as some prankster who'd picked up my phone and moved on with the night. I'd report it lost or stolen in the morning, but as we left the bar later, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I dropped off my friends, then headed home. On the drive, I kept going over the events of the night, trying to figure out where I could have left it. By the time I reached my driveway, I remembered leaving it on my bed while I'd been getting ready to go out. The realization hit me like a bucket of cold water. I stepped out of my car, suddenly hyper-aware of the quiet around me. I entered my house slowly, switching on the lights as I went, feeling a prickling sensation up my spine. My hands were clammy, As I made my way to the bedroom, and when I finally turned on the light, there it was, my phone, exactly where I thought I'd left it, sitting right in the middle of the bed. I stared at it, a feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. I knew my friends hadn't come over, and the door had been locked when I returned. So, how had someone answered my phone? With a shaky hand, I picked it up, half expecting to see missed calls or texts from whoever had answered. But there was nothing. No record of any outgoing or incoming calls. I searched the entire house for any signs that someone had been inside, but everything seemed untouched. That night, I barely slept, every creak and groan of the house jolting me awake. I kept my phone clutched tightly in my hand, as if holding it could somehow explain what had happened. I told my friends the next day, but they just laughed it off, calling it a strange coincidence. It's been years since that night, but every so often, I find myself looking over my shoulder in my own home, wondering if I truly was alone that night, or if someone had been watching me from the shadows, just close enough to reach out and answer my call. Moving to a new city is meant to be a fresh start, a new chapter in life. But when that journey takes you through desolate roads and into the eerie quiet of Nebraska's empty fields, that excitement can turn to dread. For one night on a lonely gravel road, the shadows feel a little darker, the silence a little more sinister, and your temporary shelter might be hiding something in the walls. Moving from Chicago to Nevada felt like the beginning of a new life, a clean slate. I had my car packed with the essentials, the rest of my belongings shipped to Nevada ahead of me. I wanted to make the road trip as relaxed as possible, so I planned to split the 30-hour drive into 3 days with 2 Airbnb stays. My first night would be in a remote part of Nebraska. The listing I chose was odd. Just a simple 1-story house with 2 bedrooms, but only one was shown in the photos. I ignored the lack of detail, since it was just a place to crash. As dusk settled, I found myself on a narrow, winding road with nothing but farmland stretching endlessly on either side. The miles passed without a single house or light in sight, and soon the landscape dissolved into shadows as I approached the Airbnb's long, unlit gravel path. When I arrived, the house seemed to lean forward slightly, as if watching me approach. It looked different from the photos, older, almost abandoned. I reminded myself that this was only a quick stop, so I grabbed my bag and headed to the door. There was no key box or lock, just a doorknob that looked like it belonged on an old utility closet. Reluctantly, I turned the knob and stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly neat, but uncomfortably silent. The first bedroom had no lock, and a shiver ran through me as I stared into its empty, unfurnished space. I checked the second room, relieved to find a lock on the door. However, something was unsettling. A small, weathered door built into the wall directly across from the bed. Barely 3 feet tall, it seemed too old for a modern home. I was drawn to it, almost compelled to open it, but it was locked from the other side. Trying to shake off the discomfort, I climbed into bed. Just as I was drifting off, a soft, rhythmic tapping began from the direction of the small door. My eyes snapped open, heart racing, as I strained to listen. The tapping grew louder, slow and deliberate, until it sounded almost like footsteps. I forced myself to reach for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though something waited on the other side of that small, locked door. I couldn't bear it any longer. In a frenzied rush, I packed my things and ran out to the car. As I reversed, my headlights cast a fleeting shadow behind the house, a tall figure with hollow eyes, watching me leave. I sped down the road, and finally pulled over an hour later to send a quick message to the host, warning them of an intruder. Minutes later, I received a read receipt, but no response. I never heard back and still wonder who or what was waiting in that house. Some Airbnbs offer the charm of an unfamiliar setting, the coziness of a home away from home, but there's always a risk of stumbling into the unknown, encountering people whose lives are shrouded in mystery. This story takes you into a world where the neighbor next door isn't just nosy. She's watching, waiting, and carrying secrets no one else can see. My boyfriend and I decided to stay at an Airbnb during a visit to my hometown, just a few miles away from my parents' house. It was a cozy one-bedroom condo in a quiet area, recently renovated, and perfect for a few nights. The only red flag: reviews mentioned an eccentric neighbor. I messaged the host, who assured me she'd let the neighbor know about our stay. We arrived, greeted the host, and got our keys, expecting an uneventful night. As we returned late from my parents' house, I noticed movement in the neighboring window. A gaunt woman with tangled hair and wide, unblinking eyes watched us, her face partly obscured by the dim light inside. Her gaze followed us as we made our way to the stairs, every step heavy with the sensation of her eyes digging into us. We entered our unit, closing the door as quickly as possible. Hours later, just after 3 a.m., a harsh banging shook the front door. It was frantic, almost desperate, and didn't stop. My boyfriend peered through the peephole, his face going pale. Outside, a crumpled note lay on the floor beneath a small pile of rat carcasses, mangled and bloody. As I pulled him back, we heard the woman outside begin to hum softly, muttering, "You can't stay here. You're not welcome." By morning, I dared to peek through the kitchen window. There she was, standing near our car, swaying, her hollow eyes locked onto the license plate. She seemed fixated, mumbling to herself as she slowly turned her head, making direct eye contact with me. She held her head with one hand, her nails digging into her scalp, leaving faint streaks of blood. Then, a shriek tore from her throat, a raw, unearthly sound that echoed through the parking lot. We called the host, who was horrified, and offered a full refund. When the police arrived, they had to physically restrain the woman, who kept muttering, "They're everywhere. They're everywhere," as they led her away. That night still haunts me. The feeling of her eyes on us, the lifeless rats at our door, and her twisted smile as they finally took her away. Nothing says celebration like a trip to Las Vegas with friends. The bright lights, the nightlife, the thrill of a city that never sleeps. But sometimes, lurking in the quiet suburbs beyond the glitz, lies something unsettling. When 4 friends decide to take a late-night walk, they discover that not everyone they meet is what they seem, and some have an eerie knack for finding them again. My friends and I had just finished our second year of college and decided to celebrate with a trip to Las Vegas. We rented a spacious Airbnb in a quiet neighborhood away from the Strip. It was a beautiful house, modern and well kept, the perfect setting for a carefree vacation. After unpacking and resting, my friend Alyssa suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood. We headed out as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Initially, we passed beautiful homes, but soon we turned a corner and found ourselves in a completely different area. One of broken windows, boarded-up doors, and graffiti-covered walls. An uneasy silence settled over us, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. Just then, a small SUV with its lights off pulled up beside us. An elderly woman sat in the driver's seat, her head twitching, as if she was barely in control of her own movements. She rolled down the window, a wide smile stretching across her face, as she stared at us with blank, lifeless eyes. "You two are such a cute couple," she rasped, her head jerking with each word. The air grew thick with tension as she held her gaze, unmoving, trying to play it cool. I thanked her, and we hurriedly continued on our way, her eyes following us in silence until we turned the corner. We returned to the Airbnb, locking the doors and checking the windows twice. Just as I was beginning to relax, I caught a glimpse of her car idling outside, her face barely visible through the window. Still watching, she sat motionless, eyes fixated on our front door. That night, none of us slept well, haunted by the feeling that she was waiting for something. The next day, our host texted, attaching a photo from the doorbell camera. There she was, standing in front of the house in the early hours, her face twisted into a look of furious concentration as she peered into the camera lens. I thanked the host and asked if we could leave early. As we packed, we kept glancing nervously out the window, half expecting her to reappear. We left the house that afternoon, abandoning our Vegas plans. None of us felt safe until we were back at the airport. And even now, I can't shake the feeling of those vacant eyes watching from the shadows.